So I'm just going to show you a couple ways to create symmetry, and you could probably do this in a range of programs. Here I'm in Photoshop, and it's all about duplicating and transforming. So to demonstrate, I'm just going to make my canvas a little bit bigger, cropping it using the crop tool in Photoshop and dragging it out, just giving more space. So I have this weird abstract shape on this layer, and if I want to create reflective symmetry, I can just duplicate the layer. So I can, in Photoshop, do Command J, duplicate the layer, Control J on a PC, use the Move tool, drag it out a little bit, and then in Photoshop you can transform it and flip it. So to do that, I'm going to use Command T or Control T on a PC, right click within the area where it's being transformed, so you have this blue box, and then flip it horizontally. And then I like to kind of play with the spacing, because sometimes you get some really interesting negative shapes just by the way you can combine things. So that's an example of reflective symmetry. And to show other types of symmetry, you can have another type of symmetry where it's reflective but not necessarily it's not being, the line of symmetry maybe at an angle, let's say. So here I'm going to duplicate these shapes that I already created this symmetry on. What I'll do is I'll group it first. So I'll do a Command G or Control G, then I'll duplicate those layers and I'll drag this over, and then I'll go inside one group, and then you have this type of symmetry called glide reflective, where it's basically offsetting one of the shapes. So this is a type of symmetry when you do something like this. This is asymmetrical. Another example would be rotational. So I'm going to drag this out again, and that's just playing with a rotate tool. So hitting R in Photoshop will let me actually hitting Command T in Photoshop, and then with that transform, rotating it out somewhat to play with rotational symmetry on that. Then there's probably a third type you could explore where you're just offsetting one of the shapes. So this is a type of symmetry where I just basically am offsetting, and that's called translation symmetry. So that's the third type. There are 4 types here that you can play with to create interesting combinations of symmetrical shapes. Another method in Photoshop, which is kind of interesting, this is a Photoshop thing. So I'm going to create a new artboard here to give this a try. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of these shapes, Move tool, and throw that into my artboard. I'm going to make a selection, then I'm going to define it as a brush. So I'm going to say define brush preset, and now this weird shape is a brush, so I can add these brush strokes. I'm going to create a new layer, and then there's this icon in Photoshop. It's in the newer versions of Photoshop. It looks like a butterfly. You can click on that and you can turn on these options. So the first option is this vertical symmetry, and then I can go to my brush, and that creates instant symmetry like that. So you have all these different types of symmetry to play with. Got horizontal, so I'm going to go into my brush on the brush tool, and that's horizontal. You have all these different types. When I click on these options here in Photoshop for this, I have to go back into that brush, but then I can go back in. Now that's another type. That's like a radial type of symmetry. But you got these really interesting types too, like diagonal symmetry. So going across the diagonal line, and then you have the circle symmetry, which is really interesting. So it's happening along the circle. But the really interesting one is the mandala. So you have this mandala type symmetry, and you can decide on the number of segments. So let's say I say 4, and then I add this in here, and it creates this really interesting effect. And then what you can play with is the negative of the brush. So basically you just have to have white in the foreground, you hit X, and then you can add that as well. So that's very interesting. They get some really interesting abstract shapes. Play with the brush size too. So that is the mandala effect. And this is a special aspect of Photoshop. There's other apps out there that have symmetry like tools, but in Photoshop, just look for the little butterfly icon when you're using the brush tool, Click on that and it will let you create all sorts of interesting types of symmetry.